At minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 57 degrees Celsius, breathing without protection can freeze your lungs in minutes. Yet for centuries, the Inuit have not just survived, but thrived in these temperatures, building homes from the very thing most of us spend our winters fighting against. The secret? It all starts with finding the right snow. Most people have two reactions to snow. Either they're excitedly grabbing their sleds, or they're groaning about shoveling their driveways. But for the Inuit, snow isn't just frozen water falling from the sky. It's literally the difference between life and death. When temperatures drop to a bone-chilling minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 57 degrees Celsius, having the right snow to build an igloo becomes as crucial as having the right materials to build a lifeboat in the middle of the ocean. You might think all snow is the same. I definitely did before researching this topic. I remember trying to build a snow fort as a kid using that fluffy, powdery stuff that falls in early winter. Let's just say my dreams of creating an ice palace crumbled faster than a chocolate chip cookie in a toddler's grip. The Inuit would have gotten a good laugh out of my attempt because they know something most of us don't. Powdery snow is about as useful for building an igloo as cotton candy is for building a house. What the Inuit look for is something called pukak, snow that's been packed down by strong Arctic winds. It's like nature's version of a compressed snowball, except it's been compressed by months of brutal winter winds instead of your mittened hands. This special snow is so dense that when you step on it, it doesn't give way like regular snow. Instead, it feels almost as solid as walking on packed sand at the beach. This snow is actually made up of tiny grains that have been broken down and reformed by the constant Arctic winds, creating something that's almost as strong as concrete, but can still be shaped with the right tools. The Inuit don't just eyeball the snow and think, yeah, that looks good enough. They have specific tests to check if the snow is right for building. One of their clever tricks is to stick a walking stick or spear into the snow. If it goes in easily, that's a hard no. The snow is too soft. But if it takes some real effort to push it in, and the snow makes a distinct crunching sound, bingo. That's prime igloo building material. The perfect snow for an igloo needs to have been sitting there for quite a while, getting packed down by Arctic winds. Fun fact, in some parts of the Arctic, this process can take up to 3 months. During this time, the snow crystals actually change shape and bond together, creating something that's almost as solid as ice, but still workable. It's nature's version of concrete, minus the heavy machinery and hard hat requirements. This transformed snow can support the weight of several adults standing on top of it without breaking. Try that with your backyard snow pile. But finding the right snow is only half the battle. Location is just as crucial, and this is where the Inuits' deep understanding of their environment really shines. They can't just plop an igloo down wherever they find good snow. They need to think about wind patterns because nobody wants their snow house turned into a snow tornado. Ground stability, building on hidden ice can lead to some unwanted home renovation. And even wildlife patterns that means setting up camp on a polar bear's favorite fishing spot would be unfortunate. One of my favorite bits of Inuit wisdom about snow selection comes from an old story where an elder was teaching young hunters about building igloos. He said, "The best snow for an igloo is like a good marriage. It needs to be strong enough to stand on its own, but flexible enough not to crack under pressure." I'm not sure if that's actually an old Inuit saying or if someone was just being clever, but it perfectly describes what they're looking for. The Inuit also pay attention to the angle of the ground where they'll build. A slight slope can actually be beneficial. It helps with drainage when things start to melt a tiny bit. But too much of an angle, and you might end up with the world's first snowball-shaped apartment complex rolling down a hill. It's all about finding that sweet spot. They've learned through generations of experience that the ideal location combines good snow with practical features, like being sheltered from the strongest winds, but not so sheltered that snow will pile up and bury the igloo overnight. The magic happens when they find a spot where the snow has been compacted by winds coming from multiple directions. This creates layers of snow that are compressed differently, making the snow blocks they'll cut even stronger. It's like nature's version of plywood, where each layer adds strength to the whole structure. These layers are actually visible when you cut into the snow. They appear as subtle lines, almost like the rings of a tree, each telling a story about the winds that helped create them. The Inuits' ability to read snow conditions goes beyond just finding building material. It's a survival skill passed down through generations. They can tell just by looking at the surface patterns whether snow is likely to be good building material or not. It's like having X-ray vision for snow quality, developed through centuries of Arctic living. And believe me, when you're trying to build a shelter in minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit weather, this kind of knowledge isn't just impressive, it's essential. Speaking of cutting snow blocks, well, that's where things get really interesting. You see, once you've found that perfect patch of snow, you need to know exactly how to cut it. And trust me, it's not as simple as grabbing a shovel and hacking away at it like I did in my backyard snow fort attempts, but that's a whole other story. One that involves some pretty impressive tools and techniques that turn these master builders into snow architects. Anyone who's ever tried to carve a turkey with a dull knife knows that the right tool makes all the difference. My first attempt at cutting snow bricks involved a garden shovel. Let's just say it was about as effective as using a spoon to chop firewood. The Inuit, however, have mastered snow cutting with a tool called a pana, a razor-sharp snow knife that makes slicing through compacted snow look effortless. The pana isn't just any old snow knife. It's a masterpiece of design that's been refined over thousands of years. Unlike my clumsy garden shovel that smashed more snow than it cut, a traditional pana has a blade about 18 inches long and as sharp as your grandmother's gossip. Originally made from caribou antlers or whalebone, modern versions are usually crafted from wood or metal, but the principle remains the same. It's all about making clean, precise cuts that would make a master chef jealous. A skilled Inuit builder can cut enough snow blocks for an entire igloo in less than an hour. That's faster than most of us can figure out how to assemble a piece of IKEA furniture. But don't get too excited. This isn't something you learn overnight. Young Inuit spend years practicing with smaller blocks before they're trusted to cut the ones that will keep their family warm at negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The apprenticeship process is so thorough that by the time they're ready to build their first real igloo, they can practically cut blocks in their sleep. The technique itself is amazing because you might think it's all about muscle power, but it's actually more like slicing a cake if the cake was frozen solid and your life depended on cutting it perfectly. The builder starts by marking out a rectangle in the snow, roughly 2 feet wide by 4 feet long. The depth? About 8 inches. Any thinner, and the block might crack like a bad joke at a family dinner. Any thicker, and it'll be heavier than your aunt's fruitcake. What's really impressive is how they maintain such consistent dimensions without using any measuring tools. It's all done by eye and experience. But that took me way too long to understand. They don't cut straight down. Instead, they angle the blade slightly inward at the bottom. Why? Because these blocks need to lean inward when they're stacked to form the dome shape. It's like each block is pre-programmed to fit perfectly in its spot. The first time I learned this, I felt like I'd just discovered why pizza boxes have those little plastic tables in the middle. It was one of those aha moments that make you question everything you thought you knew. The trickiest isn't even the cutting, it's getting the block out without breaking it. Remember trying to get a cake out of a pan in one piece? Now imagine doing that with a block of snow that weighs about 50 pounds and will shatter if you look at it wrong. The Inuit have perfected a technique where they cut 3 sides, then gently lever the block away from the snowbank. It's like performing a delicate dance with a partner made of frozen water. They've even developed a specific way of holding the blocks that distributes the weight evenly and prevents any stress points that could cause cracks. Each block needs to be slightly different too, depending on where it's going in the igloo. The blocks for the bottom row are usually the biggest, about 2 feet high and 4 feet long. As they go higher, the blocks get gradually smaller, like a snowman's body in reverse. And don't even get me started on the specialized blocks for the entrance and the keystone at the top. Those require more precision than parallel parking in downtown Manhattan during rush hour. Each one has to be cut at just the right angle to maintain the structural integrity of the dome. A master igloo builder can tell just by looking at a finished block whether it'll work or not. They've developed the sixth sense about snow density and structural integrity that puts modern engineering to shame. I once watched a builder tap a freshly cut block with his pana and immediately discard it because the sound wasn't quite right. It's like they can hear the snow speaking to them, probably saying things like, "Don't you dare put me in that load-bearing wall." This intuitive understanding comes from generations of knowledge passed down through careful observation and practice. You know how they say practice makes perfect? Well, in the case of igloo building, practice makes the difference between a cozy snow shelter and a pile of white powder with a hole in it. The really skilled builders can cut blocks so precisely that they fit together with barely any gap between them. We're talking tolerances that would make a German engineer weep with joy. They can even adjust their cutting technique based on the temperature and snow conditions, making subtle changes that ensure each block is perfectly suited for its purpose. And once all these perfectly cut blocks are ready, that's when the real magic begins. Because now comes the part where these massive snow Lego pieces need to be assembled into a dome that can withstand Arctic winds and hold the weight of several people. But arranging these blocks isn't just a matter of stacking them like cordwood, it's more like playing Tetris in 3D, where every piece has to lock perfectly with its neighbors. Did you ever play with those wooden blocks as a kid where you had to stack them higher and higher until they eventually came crashing down? Well, building an igloo is nothing like that. It's way harder. While most of us struggle to stack boxes in a straight line at home, Inuit builders are out there creating perfect domes using nothing but snow blocks and temperatures that would freeze your phone shut. The igloo's construction lies in its spiral design. The blocks don't just stack straight up like a brick wall, they follow a continuous spiral pattern that would make a mathematician's heart skip a beat. Each block sits slightly higher than the last, creating a gradual upward curve that eventually forms a dome. The angle starts at about 15 degrees near the base and increases to nearly 65 degrees near the top. To put that in perspective, that's like trying to build a wall that leans more and more inward without falling over, except you're doing it in a circle with frozen water while wearing mittens. The spiral pattern isn't just for show. It's actually an engineering marvel that distributes the weight of each block perfectly across the ones below it. In a properly built igloo, each block is helping to hold up its neighbors, creating a structure that's so stable it can support the weight of a full-grown polar bear on top. Though I wouldn't recommend inviting one over to test this theory. Scientists have studied this design and found that it creates a compression force throughout the structure similar to what you'd find in ancient Roman arches, except this one is made entirely of frozen water. The first row of blocks is crucial. It's like the foundation of a house, except this foundation is made of snow and sits right on top of more snow. The builders place these blocks in a circle, but with a slight inward tilt. Getting this angle right is trickier than trying to eat soup with chopsticks. Too steep, and the whole structure will collapse inward faster than your motivation on a Monday morning. Too shallow, and you'll end up with something that looks more like a snow cylinder than a dome. The precision required here is remarkable. Builders often adjust each block multiple times until it's just right. The secret sauce in the snow sandwich is how each block locks into place. The builders don't just plop one block on top of another. They carefully shape the top and bottom edges of each block to create what engineers would call a mechanical interlock. It's like nature's version of Lego, except these blocks weigh about 50 pounds each and will melt if you leave them in the sun. Each block is trimmed at specific angles on all sides to ensure it fits perfectly with its neighbors, creating a structure that's actually stronger than the sum of its parts. As the walls rise higher, each new row leans inward a bit more than the last. The builders achieve this by carefully trimming the bottom of each block at just the right angle. Remember trying to cut wrapping paper in a straight line during the holidays? This is like that, but if you mess up, you might have to sleep in minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit weather. The precision required here would make a Swiss watchmaker nervous. What's truly impressive is how the builders maintain this increasing angle without any measuring tools. It's all done by eye and experience, passed down through generations of practice. The most nerve-wracking part comes near the top of the dome. As the circle gets smaller and the angle gets steeper, each block becomes more critical than the last. One wrong move and you've got yourself a snow shower inside your almost finished igloo. The builders have to reach higher and higher, often working with one hand while holding on to something with the other. It's like playing Twister on a construction site. They've developed specific techniques for this part, including temporary support blocks that they remove once the dome is complete. Then comes the moment of truth, placing the keystone block. This final piece at the very top of the dome is the one that locks everything together. It's cut in a circular shape and has to be lowered in from the outside, then twisted into place like the world's coldest and most dangerous game of operation. When it slides into position, it creates a compression force throughout the entire structure that makes the igloo incredibly strong. The physics behind this is so impressive that modern architects still study igloo design principles. The keystone block is also slightly larger than the hole it's filling. The builder has to carefully shave it down in place until it fits perfectly, creating that final crucial compression. But despite all this precision engineering, experienced Inuit builders can put up a complete igloo dome in about an hour or two. That's faster than most people can assemble a bookshelf from IKEA, and this is an actual livable structure we're talking about. The speed comes from generations of practice and knowledge passed down through families, refined through centuries of trial and error, though I imagine the error part wasn't much fun in Arctic conditions. A master builder can complete the entire dome without a single block falling out of place, a feat that would make any modern construction worker raise their eyebrows in respect. Now that the dome is complete, you might think the hard part is over, but there's still one crucial element missing: the entrance. And trust me, this isn't as simple as cutting a hole and calling it a door. The entrance to an igloo is an engineering feat all its own, designed to keep warm air in and cold air out through some pretty clever tricks. Cutting a hole in a perfectly good snow dome might sound about as smart as drilling a hole in a boat to let the fish in, but the Inuit entrance design is pure genius. The first rule of igloo entrances: the entrance tunnel should always point downward. If that sounds backwards, you're not alone. I had the same reaction when I first learned about it. But there's some clever science behind this seemingly odd choice. Cold air sinks. That's not just a random fact from your high school physics class. It's the key to staying alive in an igloo. By making the entrance tunnel slope downward, the Inuit create a natural cold air trap. The entrance tunnel acts like a drain for cold air, keeping it from flowing up into the living space. It's like having a bouncer at a club, except instead of keeping out underage parties, it's keeping out air that could literally freeze you to death. Inside a well-built igloo, the temperature can be as much as 100 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside. You read that right. When it's minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the inside of an igloo can be a relatively cozy 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Not exactly beach weather, but definitely warm enough to keep you alive. The entrance design is a big part of making this possible, and it's achieved without any modern technology, just an incredibly deep understanding of how cold air behaves. Building the entrance isn't just a matter of digging a hole and calling it a day. The tunnel is usually about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, just big enough to crawl through if you're wearing several layers of winter clothing. Why so small? Well, have you ever noticed how your house loses heat every time someone opens the front door in winter? Now imagine that happening when it's cold enough outside to freeze your breath solid. A smaller entrance means less heat loss, which in Arctic conditions can mean the difference between life and death. The entrance size is actually calculated to be just large enough for a person wearing traditional winter clothing to squeeze through while minimizing the amount of warm air that escapes. The tunnel itself is a masterpiece of engineering that would make a modern HVAC specialist jealous. It's not just a straight shot into the igloo, it curves slightly and often includes what engineers would call a cold trap. This is basically a dip in the tunnel floor where cold air collects, like a moat around a castle, except instead of keeping out invading armies, it's keeping out invading Arctic air. Any cold air that tries to sneak in gets stuck in this trap, while the warmer air stays up in the living space where it belongs. The curve in the tunnel also helps break up wind patterns, preventing strong gusts from blasting directly into the living space. But this is where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean the kind of thing that makes physics professors get excited enough to spill their coffee. Many igloos actually have 2 levels inside, with the entrance tunnel opening onto a lower level, and then a small step up to the main living area. This isn't just to make the interior design more interesting. Remember that cold air sinks? Well, this 2-level design creates another cold trap. Any chilly air that does manage to sneak past the tunnel gets stuck on the lower level, like a burglar trapped in a basement. The height difference can be as little as 8 inches, but that's enough to create a significant temperature difference between the levels. Some particularly clever Inuit builders even create a small secondary chamber off the main tunnel. This acts like an Arctic airlock, giving people a place to brush off snow before entering the main igloo. It's also a great spot to store food. Nature's freezer with no electricity bill. I've heard stories of hunters using these chambers to store fresh seal meat, which stays perfectly frozen while being protected from scavenging animals. It's like having a walk-in freezer, except in this case, it's more like a crawl-in freezer. The temperature in these storage chambers stays remarkably constant, usually hovering right around freezing point. The wild thing about all this is that every single aspect of the entrance design serves multiple purposes. The downward slope, that's not just for trapping cold air. It also makes the entrance stronger by working with gravity instead of against it. The curved tunnel, besides trapping cold air, it also helps block wind and blowing snow from getting inside. Even the small size of the entrance serves triple duty. It minimizes heat loss, makes the structure stronger, and is easier to block with snow blocks when you need to seal up for a storm. Speaking of sealing up, that's another brilliant feature of igloo entrances. Instead of a door, which would be heavy and complicated to make, Inuit builders often just cut a snow block that fits perfectly into the entrance. When bad weather hits, they can quickly block the entrance, creating an airtight seal that's nearly as good as the rest of the igloo walls. It's like having a door made of the same material as your house, which, when you think about it, is pretty clever. These entrance blocks are often shaped slightly differently than regular building blocks, with a more tapered design that makes them easier to pull in and out from the inside. All this careful engineering of the entrance would be pointless if the igloo itself wasn't properly reinforced. And that's where the next crucial step comes in, because an igloo's strength doesn't just come from how it's built, but also from how it's finished. You might be surprised to learn that the strongest part of an igloo isn't the thick snow blocks or even the clever dome shape. It's actually a paper-thin layer of ice that forms on the inside walls. The Inuit have figured out how to turn their own body heat into a construction tool, which is probably the most environmentally friendly building technique ever invented. Though I have to say, using your body as a human blowtorch wasn't covered in any of my high school shop classes. When people first move into a newly built igloo, their body heat slowly starts to melt the innermost surface of the snow blocks. We're talking about an incredibly thin layer here, less than a millimeter. As this melted layer refreezes, it turns into a solid sheet of ice that covers every interior surface. It's like the igloo is wearing a suit of armor on the inside. This transformation process takes about an hour under ideal conditions, creating a layer of ice so perfectly smooth it almost looks like glass. The science behind this process is interesting. When snow melts and refreezes, its crystal structure completely changes. Snow is made up of delicate branch-like crystals full of air pockets, but when it melts and refreezes into ice, those crystals reorganize into a much denser, stronger structure. The resulting ice layer is so strong that it can support itself, even if all the snow behind it were to somehow disappear. It's nature's version of reinforced concrete, except it builds itself. Tests have shown that this ice layer can be up to 5 times stronger than the original snow blocks. Traditional oil lamps called quillics help speed up this process. These clever little lamps, fueled by seal or whale oil, provide both light and heat. The heat from the lamp helps melt the snow in a controlled way, while the ventilation holes at the top of the igloo ensure the temperature never gets too warm. It's like having a tiny construction crew working 24/7 to strengthen your house. Except the crew is just a small flame and the laws of physics. A single quillic can raise the temperature inside an igloo by as much as 40 degrees Fahrenheit above the outside temperature. Getting this ice layer just right requires some pretty precise temperature control. Too much heat and you'll create a tropical rainforest effect inside your igloo minus the tropical part, obviously. Too little heat and the melting freezing process won't happen properly. The ideal temperature is just above freezing, around 34 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the inside surface melts just enough to create that crucial ice layer without turning your igloo into a snow cone. Maintaining this temperature is a delicate balance that Inuit builders have mastered through generations of practice. Experienced builders can actually tell how the strengthening process is going just by touching the walls. They look for a specific type of surface texture, smooth and slightly glossy, like the inside of a frozen water bottle. If the surface feels too rough, that means the ice layer hasn't formed properly. If it feels wet or drippy, that means things are getting too warm. It's like being a snow whisperer, except instead of talking to snow, you're feeling it up. This tactile knowledge is so precise that experienced builders can detect variations in ice thickness as small as half a millimeter just by touch. The Inuit also have some clever tricks for speeding up this strengthening process in areas that need extra help. They might rub a handful of snow against a weak spot, using the friction to generate just enough heat to cause slight melting. When this spot refreezes, it creates a stronger bond. It's like applying a patch to a tire, except both the patch and the tire are made of frozen water. I tried this technique once in my backyard igloo, and let's just say it's harder than it looks. I ended up with what looked more like a snow-covered slip and slide than a reinforced wall. Any cracks or gaps that appear during this process get special attention. Builders pack them with loose snow, then use their bare hands to slightly melt it. The heat from their hands, usually around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, is perfect for this job. When this melted snow refreezes, it creates an even stronger bond than the original snow blocks. It's like using ice as both the glue and the building material, which when you think about it, is pretty brilliant. The bond created by this technique is so strong that it can actually be stronger than the surrounding snow blocks. But it's impressive how this strengthening process continues throughout the life of the igloo. Every time someone lives in it, their body heat contributes to maintaining and reinforcing that ice layer. The igloo literally gets stronger the more you use it. My gym membership could learn something from this getting stronger through use concept. Studies have shown that a well-maintained ice layer can increase the igloo's structural strength by up to 250% compared to a new, unreinforced structure. The end result is a structure that's far stronger than the sum of its parts. A properly reinforced igloo can support the weight of several people standing on top of it, though convincing people to climb onto your snow house might be a challenge. But before anyone starts climbing on the roof, there's still work to be done inside. After all, a strong igloo is great, but without the right interior setup, it's just a very sturdy snow cave. The first rule of igloo interior design: don't put your bed on the floor, unless you want to wake up as a human popsicle. The Inuit figured out long ago that the most important piece of furniture in an igloo is actually a raised platform for sleeping. My first reaction to this was, why bother with furniture made of snow? Then I learned that in an igloo, just a few feet of height difference can mean the difference between sleeping in relatively comfortable 20-degree Fahrenheit air versus trying to nap in a negative 40-degree Fahrenheit deep freeze. Here's a fact that would make any physicist smile. The temperature difference between floor level and head height in an igloo can be as much as 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's because warm air from breathing, cooking, and body heat rises and gets trapped at the top, while cold air sinks to the floor. The Inuit take advantage of this by building raised sleeping platforms about 3 feet off the ground. They're basically creating their own microclimate zones inside the igloo. In larger igloos, this temperature stratification can be so pronounced that you might need to remove layers of clothing when sitting on the platform. Building these platforms isn't like throwing together some IKEA furniture. The Inuit carefully sculpt them from packed snow, creating surfaces that are perfectly level, because nobody wants to spend the night slowly sliding off their bed. The sleeping platform usually takes up about 2/3 of the interior space and is shaped like a giant letter U. This design leaves the center area open for activities and creates natural seating areas along the edges. It's like having a built-in couch, bed, and dining area all in one, except everything's made of snow. The platform surface is usually carved with slight depressions that help hold sleeping furs in place and prevent them from sliding around. The cooking area is another masterpiece of interior design. Remember the Quolic lamp I mentioned earlier? It sits on a small snow shelf that's carefully positioned to provide both light and heat without melting the walls. The shelf has to be at just the right height. Too low and the heat gets wasted. Too high and you risk turning your ceiling into a dripping mess. Getting this placement right is trickier than trying to find the perfect spot for your TV where everyone can see it and there's no glare. The typical cooking shelf is about chest height and includes a small backstop to prevent items from falling off. It's like a tiny snow kitchen counter. Storage is handled in a way that would make Marie Kondo proud. Small niches are carved into the walls to hold essential items. These little snow shelves are angled slightly upward so things don't slide off, and they're positioned at different heights depending on how often you need to access them. Frequently used items go at comfortable reaching height, while emergency supplies might be tucked away near the ceiling, It's like having built-in cabinets, except they're free and you can make more whenever you need them. A typical igloo might have anywhere from 6 to 12 of these storage nooks, each sized and shaped for specific items. The ventilation system deserves its own round of applause. At the top of the igloo, there's a small hole about the size of your fist. This isn't just some random gap. It's precisely sized to let out enough stale air without letting in too much cold. Too big, and your igloo becomes a refrigerator. Too small, and you might wake up with a headache from too much carbon dioxide. The hole is angled so that any snow that falls on it tends to build up around the edges rather than falling straight in. It's like having a self-adjusting air conditioning system that runs on nothing but physics. In particularly well-designed igloos, this ventilation hole can maintain air quality for up to 6 people without letting the temperature drop below freezing. The floor isn't just bare snow either. Usually it's covered with a layer of small tree branches or grass, and then animal skins go on top of that. The browse creates air pockets that provide insulation from the cold ground. Without this layer, you'd lose body heat faster than a hot pizza left on a cold counter. The animal skins add another layer of insulation, plus make the floor comfortable to walk on. It's like having wall-to-wall carpeting, except this carpet could save your life. The browse layer is typically about 2 inches thick, while the fur layer can be up to 4 inches thick, creating a surprisingly comfortable walking surface. Light management inside an igloo is interesting. Snow is naturally translucent, so during the day, the whole structure glows with a soft, bluish light. It's like being inside a giant lampshade. At night, the kolik provides both heat and light, casting warm shadows that dance on the curved walls. The Inuit sometimes incorporate chunks of clear ice into the walls as windows, creating natural skylights that let in even more daylight. These ice windows are carefully selected for their clarity and are typically about 4 inches thick enough to be strong, but thin enough to let light through. Managing all these interior elements requires constant attention, but this isn't your typical home maintenance schedule of fixing leaky faucets and changing light bulbs. When small issues start appearing in an igloo, they need to be addressed quickly before they become big problems. A tiny crack or a slightly melted section might seem minor, but in the Arctic, small problems have a way of snowballing into big ones. Maintaining an igloo is like being a dentist for a building made of ice. You're constantly checking for cavities, filling holes, and making sure everything stays solid. The big difference? Your patient is perfectly happy to have you poke around with sharp objects, and you don't have to make awkward small talk while you work. Unlike modern buildings that might need maintenance every few months or years, an igloo requires daily attention to keep it in good shape. The first sign of trouble usually shows up as a small sag in the ceiling. It might only be an inch or two, but in igloo maintenance, that's like seeing a check engine light on your car's dashboard. Ignore it, and you're asking for trouble. The Inuit have learned that fixing a small sag immediately is much easier than dealing with a collapsed roof, which ranks pretty high on the list of things you don't want happening at negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. They've developed such a keen eye for these early warning signs that they can spot problems before they're visible to untrained observers. Temperature management becomes an art form when maintaining an igloo. Most people think keeping an igloo cold enough is the challenge, but actually preventing it from getting too warm is the real headache. Every human body gives off about as much heat as a 100-watt light bulb. Put 4 people in an igloo, and you've basically got a 400-watt heater running constantly. Add a cooking fire, and suddenly your cozy snow shelter is at risk of turning into the world's least practical hot tub. The ideal temperature range is surprisingly narrow. Just a few degrees can make the difference between comfort and catastrophe. The solution? Strategic ventilation and constant monitoring. Experienced igloo dwellers can read the walls like a weather forecast. Small ice crystals forming on the ceiling. Time to open the ventilation hole a bit wider. Water droplets starting to form. Better cool things down before your roof starts crying. It's like playing temperature Tetris, where the losing condition is getting snowed on in your sleep. The most skilled igloo maintainers can even tell the internal temperature just by touching the walls, accurate to within about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the maintenance tricks involves using fresh snow as a repair material. When a weak spot appears, the Inuit don't just patch it with any old snow. They carefully select snow with the right density and grain structure. Powdery snow is useless for repairs, about as helpful as trying to fix a hole in your wall with cotton candy. Instead, they look for that same dense wind-packed snow they used for the original blocks. A well-done repair job becomes nearly invisible within a day as the new snow bonds with the old structure. The bonding process is so effective that a properly repaired section can actually become stronger than the original wall. The entrance tunnel needs special attention because it takes the most abuse. Every time someone crawls in or out, they're basically giving the tunnel a tiny punch. Over time, these small impacts can add up. The solution? Regular reinforcement of the tunnel walls with fresh snow packed in just so. It's like maintaining a heavily used road, except your construction material literally falls from the sky. The trick is timing these repairs. Too soon and you're wasting effort. Too late and you might be digging yourself out of your own front door. Most entrance tunnels need some form of maintenance every 3 to 4 days of regular use. Cracks are treated like unwanted house guests. They need to be dealt with before they get too comfortable and invite their friends over. A single crack might not seem like a big deal, but in an igloo, they tend to multiply faster than rabbits at a carrot convention. The Inuit have developed a technique for sealing cracks that's almost surgical in its precision. They'll carefully widen the crack slightly, pack it with fresh snow, and then use body heat to partially melt and refreeze the repair. The result is often stronger than the original wall thanks to the way the snow crystals realign during the melting and refreezing process. Heat damage around the qualic area is another common issue. Over time, the constant heat can create a depression in the snow shelf supporting the lamp. Left unchecked, this could lead to the lamp tipping over, which would rank somewhere between very bad and extremely bad on the scale of igloo problems. The solution is to regularly rebuild the shelf, adding fresh snow to maintain its height and shape. It's like having to regularly iron your shirt, except the iron is trying to melt your ironing board. A typical lamp shelf might need rebuilding every 5 to 7 days, depending on how much cooking is done. Even the sleeping platform needs regular attention. The surface gradually deforms under the weight of people sleeping on it, creating uncomfortable dips and bumps. Every few days, the surface needs to be re-leveled using fresh snow. It's like fluffing your pillow if your pillow was made of frozen water and required a snow knife to fluff it. The platform typically settles about half an inch per week under regular use, requiring periodic adjustments to maintain its comfort and insulating properties. All this maintenance might sound like a lot of work, but it's just part of life in an igloo. Besides, there comes a point when even the best-maintained igloo reaches the end of its life. Maybe the weather's warming up, or perhaps the structure has been patched one too many times. That's when you need to know when to say goodbye and start fresh. Breaking up with your igloo is never easy, but sometimes you just have to know when to let go. Unlike modern houses that can last for decades, igloos are more like extended-stay snow hotels. They're not meant to be forever homes. A typical igloo has a lifespan somewhere between a few days and a few weeks, depending on weather conditions and how many patch jobs it's been through. It's like a temporary snow castle that slowly transforms back into regular snow, which is actually pretty poetic if you're into that sort of thing. Weather plays the biggest role in determining when it's time to say goodbye. When temperatures start climbing above 20 degrees Fahrenheit, even the best-maintained igloo begins to show its age. The walls start getting that saggy look, like a snowman on a slightly warm day, and no amount of maintenance can stop the inevitable. At this point, trying to keep the igloo going is like trying to keep an ice cream cone solid in the sun. Technically possible, but way more trouble than it's worth. The degradation can be surprisingly rapid. An igloo might lose up to 2 inches of wall thickness per day when temperatures hover around the freezing point. Inuit hunters often build strings of igloos along their regular hunting routes, spaced about a day's journey apart. These aren't maintained continuously. Instead, they're allowed to naturally deteriorate and are rebuilt as needed. It's like having a chain of emergency shelters, except you have to rebuild them every time you use them. Some popular hunting routes might have had hundreds of igloo sites that were used and rebuilt over generations. Records from early Arctic explorers suggest that some of these routes were in continuous use for over 500 years. The decision to abandon an igloo isn't taken lightly. The Inuit have a set of clear signs they look for. When the ceiling height has decreased by more than a foot due to sagging, when the walls have thinned to less than 8 inches thick, or when the entrance tunnel has needed rebuilding more than 3 times in a week. It's like having a checklist for when to replace your car, except instead of checking the mileage, you're measuring snow thickness. These measurements aren't just arbitrary. They're based on generations of experience and represent the minimum requirements for structural safety. Abandoned igloos don't just disappear. They slowly transform into what hunters call marker igloos. As they collapse and get buried by fresh snow, they create distinctive bumps in the landscape that other travelers can spot from a distance. These bumps tell experienced hunters two important things. First, that this is a good spot to build a new igloo since someone thought it was good enough before, and second, that they're on a known travel route. It's like leaving a sign that says, "Good camping spot," except the sign is made of collapsed snow. These marker igloos can remain visible for several seasons, creating a natural mapping system across the vast Arctic landscape. The reuse of old igloo sites is actually pretty clever from an engineering standpoint. The ground at these sites has already been compacted by previous structures, making it more stable for new construction. Plus, the old site often creates a natural wind barrier that helps accumulate the right kind of snow for building. It's like nature doing the site preparation work for you. The Inuit have found that rebuilding on old sites can save up to 2 hours of preparation time compared to starting fresh in a new location. The compacted base can be up to 30% denser than undisturbed snow, providing a much more stable foundation. Sometimes an abandoned igloo gets an unexpected second life as an emergency shelter for other travelers. Even a partially collapsed igloo can provide better protection than no shelter at all. The Inuit have a saying that translates roughly to, "An old igloo is better than a new storm," which makes a lot more sense than most of the sayings we have about snow. These emergency shelters have saved countless lives over the centuries, proving that even a deteriorating igloo can serve a purpose. A partially collapsed igloo can still maintain an interior temperature up to 30 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than outside. The timing of abandonment often follows a practical pattern. Many hunters plan their trips so that they'll be using an igloo during the coldest part of their journey when the structure is most stable. As temperatures warm up, they'll time their return trip to coincide with when the igloo would need to be abandoned anyway. It's like planning a road trip around the weather, except your rest stops might literally melt if you get the timing wrong. This careful planning is essential for survival in the Arctic, where timing mistakes can have serious consequences. The lifespan of an igloo also affects how hunters store their supplies. Any equipment left behind in an abandoned igloo needs to be properly elevated and marked with poles that stick up above the snow level. Otherwise, you might come back to find your supplies buried under several feet of collapsed snow and fresh powder. It's like putting a really long marker on your car in a snowy parking lot, except instead of finding your car, you're trying to find your spare hunting gear. These marker poles often need to be at least 6 feet tall to remain visible throughout the winter. When spring arrives and temperatures consistently stay above freezing, even the most well-built igloos return to their original form, just plain old snow and water. It's a perfect example of nature's recycling program where nothing goes to waste and everything gets reused in the next winter's construction season.